Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into a really fascinating stack of writings by David Hume, one of the key thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment.
That's right. You've given us a collection that, well, it really shows the incredible range of his mind, doesn't it? We're talking government, politics, human nature, religion, even the arts.
Absolutely. And our mission here is to sort of navigate through these essays you've shared, pull out the core insights, and really understand what Hume was arguing about all these big topics.
Yeah, finding those essential, maybe sometimes surprising bits that make Hume still feel relevant, centuries later.
Okay, let's get into it. First off, who was this guy, David Hume? The biographical intro gives us a bit of a picture.
It does. He was born in Edinburgh, 1711. His dad died when he was young, and the plan initially was for him to go into law.
Which famously, he just couldn't stomach. He said he was secretly reading, like, Cicero and Virgil instead of his law books. Tried commerce, too, briefly. That didn't work out either.
No. He basically ditched both and decided, literature and philosophy, that was his path. But his early stuff, the really big philosophical works like the Treatise of Human Nature, well, they didn't exactly set the world on fire at first.
Hard to imagine now, given how important they are. But it was his essays, the political and moral ones. A lot of what we're looking at today, they were actually quite well received, weren't they? Helped build his name.
Exactly. That success, plus being pretty careful with money and some later jobs, it let him build up what he calls an independent fortune. He spent time as a librarian really useful for his history writing and as a diplomat in France. His reputation there was maybe even bigger than in England at the time.
Right, France loved him. Then he came back to Edinburgh, financially secure by about 1769.
The source even mentions him at the opera in Paris, Uncle du Joli Minois, between two pretty faces. Gives you a sense he wasn't just some dusty academic.
Definitely paints a picture. And his autobiography, My Own Life, written right near the end, it's quite something. He talks about facing death with very little pain, still keen on studying, still cheerful in company.
Yeah, amazing attitude. He describes himself in that text, too.
Oh, yeah, that bit's fantastic. How did he put it?
He said he was a man of mild dispositions, of command of temper, of an open, social, and cheerful humor, capable of attachment, but little susceptible of enmity, and of great moderation in all his passions. Even his love of literary fame, his ruling passion, he implies, was, well, moderate.
Mild, cheerful, moderate. Quite the self-assessment for someone diving into such deep, sometimes tricky subjects. Okay, let's follow him into those subjects, starting with his political philosophy. And here's a big one right away. He actually thought politics could be a kind of science.
Yes, well, maybe not science like physics, but he argued it could be reduced to general truths, stable principles, things that work kind of independently of who's specifically in charge, their personal character.
That feels a bit strange today, doesn't it? We focus so much on leaders' personalities.
We do. And Hume isn't saying individuals are irrelevant. Absolute governments, he notes, really depend on who's running the show. But his main point, especially for free governments, is about this system. A well-designed free government, he thought, has checks and controls that make it in the interest of even, say, bad or selfish politicians to act for the public good.
So the structure itself guides behavior. Even bad intentions can lead to good outcomes.
That's the idea. He uses history to back it up. Look at the Roman Republic, he says. Giving lawmaking power directly to the people worked okay when it was small, but as it grew, without proper representation or checks, anarchy, civil war, the structure failed.
Right. It wasn't necessarily about individual Romans suddenly becoming worse people.
Exactly. Or think about Venice versus Poland, the nobility there. In Venice, they shared power as a group, so they had a collective interest in keeping things stable across the state. In Poland, each noble had power over their own patch, leading to endless feuds and weakening the whole country. Again, it's the structure of how power was held.
Okay, so his ideal forms, hereditary prince, nobility without vassals, a representative people, these are all based on how he thinks power and self-interest actually work within those structures.
Precisely. He saw these as based on, well, almost eternal principles of human nature and society.
Now, here's a really provocative bit, maybe uncomfortable for us today. He argues free governments often end up being more oppressive towards conquered provinces than absolute monarchies are.
It's a striking claim, isn't it? And he backs it up with examples: Republican Rome versus Imperial Rome, how England treated Ireland versus how France treated its conquered lands, Carthage, Corsica.
But why? Why would a freer government behave worse externally?
Hume's logic is this. In a free government, the legislators are mainly thinking about their own group's interests back home. So they impose rules, taxes, monopolies that benefit themselves, not the province. Plus, he says, officials sent out to govern provinces and republics often have short terms. They might be tempted to grab what they can quickly before their time's up.
Whereas an absolute monarch, well, they see everyone as their subject, more or less equally, right? So unless there's personal favoritism, they don't have the same built-in reason to exploit one part of the empire just to benefit another. Their interest is more in the overall stability and wealth of the whole kingdom, even if it's just for their own power.
Exactly that. It ties back to his point about fixed laws and institutions. He uses the example of Genoa. The state itself is often chaotic, but the Bank of St. George, run by many of the same people within that state, operated with incredible integrity for ages. Why? Because the bank had clear, established rules and methods. Good institutions matter.
So, good structures can guide imperfect people to good results, but bad structures can enable bad behavior. He also mentions this tension between public spirit and private virtue.
Yeah, he points out that times of great public spirit, like Republican Rome, weren't always the most moral privately. Good laws, good institutions can maintain order even if personal morals aren't perfect.
And he talks about political zeal, using Sir Robert Walpole as an example. Walpole was a huge figure then.
Right. Hume basically argues for chilling out a bit in politics. If you attack a minister like Walpole super intensely, saying he's ruining everything, you're kind of implying the whole system, the Constitution, must be broken to let one guy do that much damage.
So the problem isn't just the minister, it's deeper.
Yeah. And if you defend him with that same extreme passion, then you're suggesting the Constitution's so strong that one minister, no matter how bad, can't really hurt it much anyway. So why the excessive defense? His point is, oppose bad ministers, sure, but with proportionate zeal. Don't tear down the whole framework in the process.
Okay, structure, institutions, moderation. Got it. Now, maybe his most surprising idea about government, that the power of the few over the many rests ultimately on opinion, not force.
This is really central and, yeah, pretty startling. I mean, think about it. There are way more governed people than governors. Physically, the power's with the masses, so rulers, even tyrants, must rely on something else.
And that something else is just what people think.
Basically, yes. He breaks it down into two main types. First, opinion of interest. This is the general feeling that government itself is useful, better than chaos, and that the current government is doing an okay job, or at least is advantageous. Second, opinion of right. This is belief in the government's legitimacy, the right to rule, and also belief in the right to property, respecting ownership.
So believing the system is legitimate, generally beneficial, and respecting property, that's what actually holds power up.
That's Hume's argument. These opinions, plus things like self-interest, honor, just plain habit, that's the real foundation. He even sees obedience as a kind of necessary new duty society invents to prop up justice because, well, relying on individual virtue alone just doesn't cut it.
And he draws a key line between liberty and authority here.
He does. Liberty is great. It's the perfection of society. But authority, that's essential to its very existence. No authority, no society. Liberty needs guarding, sure, but authority, being essential, kind of supports itself, sometimes brutally.
Which leads us to that famous, maybe cynical maxim he talks about. When you're designing the government, you should assume every man ought to be supposed a knave.
Yeah, that's a punchy one. The idea is don't build your system expecting people to be angels. Assume they're acting out of self-interest and build in checks accordingly.
But he also says this is true in politics, but not necessarily, in fact, in everyday life. How does that work?
His explanation is about group behavior. He thinks people are generally more honorable one-on-one, but put them in a political party or faction. The need for individual honor gets diluted. If an action helps the party approves, even if it hurts the public. You start caring less about outside criticism because your group backs you up.
Ah, okay. The group shields you and reinforces the self-interest.
Pretty much. So, a smart government doesn't rely on hoping individuals will be good. It sets things up so different self-interested groups have to kind of check each other and cooperate to get what they want, hopefully leading to a public good.
He uses this to look at the British Constitution, especially the House of Commons. How does this powerful body get checked?
According to Hume in these sources, it's checked by the individual interests of its members. The Crown holds the power of patronage, giving out jobs, titles, favors. This influence aligns the private interests of many MPs, getting ahead basically, with keeping the existing mixed system going.
So a certain amount of what we might see as, well, influence or dependence is actually necessary for the system to work, in his view.
He argues that some level of it, given how the British system was set up, was needed to preserve that balance. But he admits it's incredibly hard to know where the line is, how much influence is too much. That's the tricky part.
He even has that funny observation about how the court party and the country party argued differently.
Right. He noticed the court party, defending the government, tended to be less dogmatic in conversation, more willing to concede points. The country party, the opposition usually talking about liberty, was often more rigid, more likely to dismiss opponents as just being paid off. He thought it was maybe easier to sound principled when you're opposing than when you're defending the messy realities of power.
Let's shift to a really tough question Hume tackled, the future of British government. Was it heading towards absolute monarchy or a republic, and which did he think would happen?
He lays out the arguments for both directions pretty carefully.
Okay, what suggests a drift towards monarchy?
He points to the growing power and money of the crown, the existence of a standing army, something ancient republics feared, and he compares the crown's growing financial clout to how massive private wealth could corrupt ancient republics.
And the case for it becoming a republic?
There, he suggests the crown's power, being legal, might be less dangerous than, say, a rich individual seizing power illegally. He also felt the general opinion was shifting towards liberty, and, well, monarchies can just naturally fade or decline over time.
And his own prediction, this is where it gets really interesting.
It is. He says quite bluntly that while liberty is obviously better than slavery, if he had to choose the path Britain seemed likely to take, he'd rather wish to see an absolute monarch than a republic in this island.
Whoa, why on earth would he prefer monarchy?
His logic was about the transition. He figured a republic would probably mean the House of Commons becoming the supreme power. And he feared that would lead to chaos, intense faction fighting, maybe civil war over elections, or the Commons just refusing to dissolve and becoming a kind of permanent tyranny of a faction, a small, potentially corrupt group running everything.
So he thought the path to a republic from that starting point looked more violent and likely to end up as a different kind of tyranny anyway, which might just collapse back into monarchy eventually.
Exactly. So absolute monarchy, while bad, seemed like the easiest death, the true euthanasia for the existing constitution, compared to the messy, likely tyrannical birth of the republic he envisioned emerging from the Commons. It's pretty stark analysis, and maybe another reason he urged political moderation. The alternatives might be worse than people think.
That moderation theme again. Now, one specific feature of Britain he really focuses on is the freedom of the press. Why was it so free there compared to other places?
Hume connects it directly to that mixed government structure. Because you have these different parts, king, lords, commons, all kind of watching each other suspiciously, the press becomes vital. It's the alarm system, especially for the more Republican parts, to warn everyone if the court seems to be grabbing too much power.
So it's like a necessary check born out of that internal jealousy within the system.
That's his take. The side defending liberty needs the press to rally public opinion against potential overreach by the monarchical side.
He does call this unbounded liberty one of the evils or downsides of a mixed system, but says it's hard to fix without damaging liberty itself.
Yeah, but he also argues it's less dangerous than, say, ancient rabble-rousing speakers. Why? Because reading is solitary. You read a pamphlet alone and coolly, you don't have that immediate infectious passion of a crowd being whipped up by an orator.
Right, the medium matters. Less immediate incitement to action.
Exactly. And he makes a really strong claim. He basically says that when you see serious attempts to shut down the press, you know that the liberty of Britain is gone forever. He saw it as a kind of canary in the coal mine for freedom.
Okay, let's pivot away from government structures now and look at Hume on human nature itself. He tackles that old debate, dignity or meanness of human nature.
Yeah, a classic philosophical question. Hume breaks it down, suggesting a lot depends on your comparison point. Are we comparing humans to animals? We look pretty dignified then, to perfect wisdom. We look pretty mean to each other. Well, most of us are somewhere in the middle.
And he really zeroes in on our motives, right?
Yes. Is it all just selfishness underneath?
Okay.
Or are social, virtuous motives real drivers of behavior? That seems to be the core issue for him.
And the meanness side often says, oh, you only did that good deed because it felt good or because you wanted praise.
Hume pushes back quite cleverly here. He says, look, the pleasure you get from doing good, that's the effect of already having a virtuous feeling, like kindness. It's not the cause. You don't help your friend in order to feel pleasure. You feel pleasure because you already care about your friend and help them.
Subtle distinction. Pleasure follows the virtue. It doesn't cause it.
Right. And on wanting praise Or vanity, he makes another interesting point. Unlike, say, pure greed, which clearly taints an action, wanting recognition for doing good is often tangled up with actually loving virtue itself. He even suggests loving the fame of virtue can be a sure proof of the love of virtue. It's not necessarily a separate selfish thing replacing the virtue.
So seeking praise doesn't automatically mean the act wasn't genuinely virtuous. Our motives are mixed.
Exactly. He resists that purely cynical view that everything good is just hidden selfishness.
He also dives into the psychology of religion, contrasting superstition and enthusiasm.
Yeah, he sees these as two ways true religion can get corrupted. Superstition, he thinks, comes from negative emotions, fear, sadness, ignorance. It makes people anxious about the unknown, feel unworthy, and look for ways to appease supernatural powers, often through priests and rituals.
And enthusiasm.
That comes from the opposite corner. Pride, confidence, strong emotions, also ignorance. It gives people a big sense of self-importance, a feeling of direct connection to God, and often leads them to dismiss earthly rules, traditions, and priests.
How does this affect the role of priests?
Superstition loves priests. If you feel scared and unworthy, you need someone to mediate for you. Priests gain huge power.
So enthusiasm must undermine priests.
Totally. Enthusiasts think they have a direct line to the divine. Why would they need a priest? He uses groups like the Quakers and Independents as examples. They largely rejected priestly authority.
Which one lasts longer, according to Hume?
He reckons superstition is more durable. It creeps in gradually, society often accepts it, and crucially, you have an organized priesthood with a vested interest in keeping it going. Enthusiasm. It's like a fire burns brightly but often burns out. There's usually no structure to maintain it across generations.
And how do they relate to civil liberty?
Superstition, being based on fear, makes people submissive, tame, and abject. So it's an enemy of civil liberty. Enthusiasm, though, coming from a place of confidence and boldness, is often a friend to liberty. It encourages independence, rejecting hierarchies, both religious and political. He notes how enthusiasts like the Independents and rationalists like the deists found common ground politically in wanting a commonwealth, and how later Whig leaders often weren't very orthodox religiously.
It's fascinating how he analyzes religion through psychology, temperament, and its political impact.
Absolutely. It's all part of his attempt to understand human nature and how it shapes society.
Okay, just briefly before we wrap up and connect this to today, he also touched on arts, science, and eloquence. He had that thought in the civil liberty essay that maybe the world was still too young to have figured out all the general truths about politics yet. Society keeps changing. Like, ancient political writers barely talked about trade.
Yeah, it shows his awareness of historical context, how things evolve. We might not have all the answers yet.
And he noticed that while arts and sciences tended to pop up in free nations, the modern era, his era, seemed better at reasoning and science than at things like poetry or especially eloquence.
He really digs into that lack of great modern eloquence. Britain was a popular government. It should have produced amazing speakers, he thought, but it hadn't matched ancient Greece or Rome, no modern Demosthenes or Cicero.
And why did he think that was?
A few reasons. Modern laws were really complex, less room for those big, passionate appeals to basic justice. And he felt modern audiences just weren't as receptive to strong, emotional arguments, the pathetic style.
So the context changed, the audience changed.
Yes, but interestingly, he still thought that ancient, passionate style was actually better, juster, and could still work if someone had the genius to pull it off today.
And he wasn't keen on how people spoke publicly in his time?
No. He criticized the trend of pretending to speak off the cuff, extemporary. He felt it led to disorganized, rambling speeches, even when people were trying to make a logical argument. He clearly valued structure and preparation.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a huge amount. Hume the man, his ideas on government structure, opinion as power, political parties, the future he saw for Britain, free press, human motives, religion psychology, even eloquence.
It really is a deep dive. His mind went everywhere, always trying to understand why things are the way they are.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener. Why should we care about these nearly 300-year-old ideas today?
Well, because Hume gives us such powerful tools to think about our own times. His ideas about how government structures influence behavior, maybe more than leaders' personalities, about power resting on opinion, about party dynamics, the constant tension between freedom and order. These are absolutely live issues right now.
That call to think about the science of politics, the underlying principles, rather than just focusing on the latest personality clashes, that feels incredibly relevant, doesn't it? And his warnings about potential flaws in even mixed governments, like hidden influence or factionalism, they echo in today's debates.
Definitely. And his thoughts on human nature, our mixed motives, how group behavior changes us, the link between our temperament and our beliefs. You can see parallels everywhere, from social media fights to political polarization.
Reading Hume is like getting a reminder that the big questions we grapple with, how to live together, how to govern ourselves, they aren't new. And maybe some answers lie in understanding these deeper patterns of human nature and society that he was trying to map out.
He really makes you question your own assumptions about power, about legitimacy, about what makes society tick or fall apart.
This has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for bringing these sources to us and walking us through Hume's thought.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to revisit Hume.
And as we finish, here's a final thought from Hume for you to chew on, building on what we discussed. He argued, based on his historical analysis, that free governments, the kind we generally prefer, might actually be more oppressive towards people in conquered territories than absolute monarchies are, because the rulers have different incentives. How might that idea, which feels really counterintuitive to us today, we tend to equate free with good, or just how might that challenge how we think about the link between a country's internal politics and how it acts towards others? Something to ponder.